My name is Phil Walls. I'm a pharmacist and Chief Clinical Officer for MyMatrix. Thank you for joining today's edition of CompTalks. First of all, I want to thank the folks at Risk and Insurance for providing this fantastic stage that I'm on today. Whereas in actuality, this stage does not exist. In fact, I'm in the kitchen of my home in Tampa, Florida. Thanks to technology, this is just one of many changes that we're seeing that's been brought about by the quarantine caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to give a shout out to my video crew, which also does not exist. My wife today is serving as my director, my producer, and my videographer. And in just a little while, she's also going to offer IT support as we put this into something called Dropbox, which I have no idea how to use. But this is all part of the new normal. A lot of things are going to change as a result of the quarantine, not least of which is drug development. And that's what we're talking about today. Now, if you were tuning in hopes of learning about drugs being used to treat COVID-19, that actually is not my subject matter. I may mention a couple of drugs because they're pertinent, but my goal is to actually talk about the impact that COVID-19 is having on drug development. And my prediction is that this impact is going to be long-lasting. So let's begin. One of the first things that happened following the realization that the United States was dealing with the pandemic was on January 31st of this year when Alex Azar, Secretary of Health and Human Services, declared a public health emergency. Now, this was a very important, vital first step. It was a very appropriate action to take. Declaration of this emergency put a number of processes into place. It allowed organizations like the CDC to access certain funds to develop their fight against the pandemic. It allowed certain organizations to start tracking the disease itself. In fact, it even made provisions and certain rule requirements of HIPAA that they be modified to allow tracking of this condition, all vital aspects of this. It even made modifications to the practice of telemedicine, which has proved so important during the quarantine. So as I said, this was a very important first step. What happened next? Well, the next headlines I saw was that there was a flurry of activity at the NIH regarding drug development. Now, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, is not an organization that I usually link to phrases like a flurry of activity. So what was going on? Soon thereafter, about the same time, I also saw an announcement that the FDA had released an emergency use authorization for a somewhat obscure drug known as hydroxychloroquine. Now, hydroxychloroquine, some of you may be familiar with. The brand name is Plaquenil, although it's widely available generically. But Plaquenil had been studied in the past for use in conditions like arthritis. So in workers' compensation, which the majority of my audience is involved in, we do see its use, not very often, but it does happen. So key takeaway here is if you see patients on hydroxychloroquine, do not assume that they're being treated for COVID-19. It's much more likely that they're being treated for pain associated with arthritis. In fact, during this entire process, MyMatrix never made a recommendation to any of our clients that they add hydroxychloroquine to their formulary. We never agreed with some of the things that we were seeing, and therefore it just was not appropriate. Furthermore, that emergency use authorization that the FDA released limited its use to hospitalized COVID-19 patients. So a couple of important distinctions there. Now, what happened next? Well, that infamous tweet from President Trump stating that I happen to be taking it. And of course, he was referring to hydroxychloroquine. A previous tweet had actually announced that I have bought millions of doses, speaking for President Trump. Matter of fact, he bought 29 million doses from India. So this is all April-May timeframe. By June, our federal government found itself in possession of 63 million doses of a drug that was completely ineffective against COVID-19. The background to this? Well, it all started with a very small French study that was published in March of this year. That study drew an observation that hydroxychloroquine, in combination with azithromycin, reduced the viral load in some patients. Based on that, again, President Trump declared this drug could be a game changer in the battle against COVID-19. Now, my intention today is certainly not to disparage President Trump. I'm simply repeating the things as they happened, making these observations, sort of putting all of these headlines together into a cohesive story. But his declaration that it was a game changer based on this small study is sort of where a lot of these concerns all started. Since March, the Journal of the American Medical Association released a study that disproved the conclusions of the original French study. In fact, not only did they determine that hydroxychloroquine in combination with azithromycin was ineffective, the use of hydroxychloroquine in these patients actually increased the incidence of cardiac arrest. So we now have a drug that the United States possesses all these doses, that it's ineffective and potentially dangerous in some patients. So what did we do? Where did we go wrong? Well, are there things that we can learn from history? Personally, I think there are. A couple of events that I want to discuss today. Now, when it comes to pandemics, thank goodness we do not have a lot of information to draw on. They are relatively rare, and as I said, that's a good thing. So what can we look at? Well, let's go back to the smallpox pandemic of the 1700s. Let's specifically talk about the development of a vaccine in that instance. The late 1700s, in fact 1790s, a British physician, Edward Jenner, made an observation, and there's that word again, observation, that milkmaids did seem to have some type of immunity when it came to developing smallpox. Now, smallpox was extremely dangerous, killed millions of patients millions of people during this time. Dr. Jenner found it fascinating that he had identified a population that seemed to have some type of immunity. Upon further investigation, he determined that the milkmaids that had developed immunity had actually been stricken with another condition known as cowpox. Their close association with cows had allowed the condition that cows had, known as cowpox, to be transmitted to humans. But once someone contracted cowpox, they seemed to have an immunity to smallpox. Now, another fact that Dr. Jenner had access to was that once someone suffered smallpox, if they survived, they had an immunity to it. They would never catch it again. So he developed a theory that, well, if smallpox confers immunity against smallpox subsequent exposure, perhaps cowpox did the same thing. Next, Dr. Jenner did something that would not be allowed today. He exposed an 8-year-old boy to cowpox. He did this by taking scrapings from a cowpox lesion on a milkmaid, scratching those into the skin of the child, and actually giving the child cowpox. Next, he exposed the child to smallpox, and indeed the child had developed immunity. Now, today, to experiment with a child, or anyone for that matter, would be unconscionable. Thank goodness in Dr. Jenner's time, not only did this not harm the child, it actually gave the child immunity to smallpox. And thank goodness for the entire population of the planet, this led to the full-scale development of a smallpox vaccine. Now, is this not what we did when it came to hydroxychloroquine and making an observation that it seemed to have an effect on patients? Actually, no, not at all. First of all, I want to talk about some concerns with that French study. It was a very small study. Only about 20 patients were involved. Patients that ended up dying during the course of the study or ending up in the ICU were not included. So the results were somewhat skewed and extremely limited. To make that observation that this was an effective drug, a game changer in the battle against COVID-19, was not warranted. Dr. Jenner, on the other hand, in the 1790s, had facts available to him. he knew that someone that had smallpox was immune to a subsequent exposure to smallpox. He knew that milkmaids that had cowpox also had this immunity. To have drawn a similar conclusion at that time that we drew with hydroxychloroquine today would be to assume that being a milkmaid conferred immunity to smallpox. And people would have gone out, changed their occupation, and become a milkmaid in order to not catch smallpox. So you can see a tremendous leap there. What Dr. Jenner had theorized or developed a theory about was proven true and led to the development of a vaccine. So that was, takeaway from that is we should only make our conclusions when we have facts available, and we've done a significant amount of research in order to obtain those facts. Let's take a look at another historical perspective, not related to a pandemic, but related to drug development as it exists today. And I think this is an equally important lesson. Let's go to late 1950s Germany and the introduction of a drug known as thalidomide. This was an era when a lot of people around the world were experiencing significant levels of anxiety. In fact, in the United States in this time, 1 out of 7 Americans were taking a sedative. And in fact, those sedatives in the 1950s, early 1960s were actually barbiturates. Now, I'm sure many people in the audience may not even be familiar with barbiturates. In the 60s, they were referred to as downers. Drugs you may have heard of would include phenobarbital, which is the most common, secobarbital, which may be used in a hospital setting, but their use today is very, very limited. In the 1950s, they were the only sedative available, and they had widespread use. Thalidomide was the first non-barbiturate sedative. It was also considered to be an extremely safe drug. In fact, it was so safe, it was assumed to be safe to use during pregnancy. It was so safe that it was sold over the counter. In fact, its sales at that time matched those of aspirin, which during the 1950s was one of few pain relievers available. Sales of aspirin were quite high, and thalidomide were just as high. Now, 1961, an Australian physician also made an observation, this time concerning the use of thalidomide. He found that in patients he was treating that were also pregnant, that it helped to relieve their morning sickness. It was effective against nausea. Now, based on ads for the drug, it was stated that this drug was so safe, it was safe even for use during pregnancy. So he started recommending it to his pregnant patients to help them with morning sickness. This was adopted almost worldwide, with the exception of the United States. Credit should be given to our then head of the FDA, because she felt that there was not enough evidence yet for the FDA to approve its use during pregnancy. So she never did, but she was one of few exceptions. But thank goodness she held a very strong viewpoint on that, because in 1962 we started seeing the first signs of birth defects as the result of use of thalidomide during pregnancy. Horrible tragedy. Babies were being born without limbs, or in some cases with flipper-like limbs, a condition known as phocomelia. Just a horrible tragedy. By 1962, thalidomide was being banned in almost every country around the world, certainly in the United States. In fact, in the United States, it led to the adoption of the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. Kefauver-Harris, among other things, led to what we see today in terms of clinical trials for new drug development. And when we talk about drug development, when we talk about the amount of time it takes, all this traces back to Kefauver-Harris. It led to a clinical review process that can take from 8 to 12 years to get a drug through these clinical trials, approved by the FDA, and to the market. In fact, Big Pharma blames this development process on many of the high prices that we see when it comes to prescription drugs. The FDA says this is the process that's necessary to make sure that drugs are safe and effective. The FDA has a very difficult job. They have to find a balance between making sure that drugs are safe and effective, and yet at the same time getting them to market, especially in life-saving situations. And they receive considerable criticism for this. They're oftentimes criticized that if they would only allow drugs to market faster, we could save more lives. Their viewpoint is we have a process to prevent another tragedy like the thalidomide. The steps are there for a purpose. Takes me back once again to how on earth are we now seeing a flurry of activity at the NIH? And what does that even mean? Well, it means that there are over 500 drug development processes in effect right now. The FDA has reviewed over 200 clinical trials for drugs that are purported to be effective against COVID. All this came about as a result of a COVID-19 approval acceleration process. This is allowing drugs to get through the process faster. One drug that I'm sure you've seen in the headlines is known as remdesivir. Shows tremendous promise in the treatment of COVID-19. So perhaps the changes we're making are going to lead to a cure and in other avenues of research, possibly lead to a vaccine for COVID-19. Now, what does that have to do with the future of drug development? Well, August of this year, I'm already seeing headlines about things that are going to make changes. One, very, very significant in my opinion, is that 32 state attorneys general have approached Health and Human Services asking that changes be made in the way patents are handled. They looked at Gilead Pharmaceuticals, the company that makes remdesivir, and they made a very bold statement. They said that Gilead should not profit from the pandemic. They asked HHS to look at the licensing that Gilead had, relax some of the patent restrictions, and allow other companies to make this drug with the hopes that one is going to prevent the potential of shortages of the drug as it's made available around the world, and two, it would hold down the price. Now, I think this is going to be a lengthy battle for these attorneys general, but it set something in motion that I didn't think we would ever see during my career as a pharmacist. Another headline that I've seen very recently had to do with a new process at the FDA already that allows for the fast track approval of certain novel antibiotics. Now, what this means is for patients that are in life-threatening situations, access to some of these newer novel antibiotics is going to be allowed much faster than it would have under the traditional Kefauver-Harris approach to drug research. These novel antibiotics are put into a fast-track program so that they get through the approval process faster. This, without a doubt, because it's already in place, is going to have an impact on bringing drugs to market and saving more lives. So I think, like I said, we're already seeing changes when it comes to COVID-19. Not only am I sitting in front of this green screen today coming to you on a virtual stage, but we'll see changes in drug development. We're seeing changes in telemedicine, and I think these changes will continue and have a lasting impact on the practice of medicine and pharmacy as we know it today. Thank you very much.